So there's this really famous quote from Qaid Azam. Think 100 times before you take a decision, but once that decision is taken, stand by it as one man. It's an incredibly profound statement about the sheer weight of responsibility, right? When you actually stop and think about the people tasked with running a country, the literal machinery of the state, these words aren't just motivational fluff. They are a necessary mandate. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how that state machinery is built, governed, and most importantly, kept in check.
Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to take a really fascinating look under the hood of Pakistan's federal civil service ecosystem. We hear words like bureaucracy and public servants tossed around all the time, but how does it actually function on paper? How do they ensure fairness? And what exactly happens when someone breaks the rules? We're going to explore all of this. We'll start way up high with the macro-level constitutional laws, and then zoom all the way down to the highly specific micro-level realities of everyday office admin. Because ultimately, these are the folks managing your taxes, securing your highways, and running the country you live in.
Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. Number 1, the Civil Servants Act. 2, the powers of the Federal Service Tribunal. 3, the deputationist controversy. And 4, departmental leave policies. All right, part 1, the foundation, the Civil Servants Act of 1973. This 1973 Act, it's absolutely the bedrock piece of legislation for federal government employees. But what I find super interesting is the strict legal definition of a civil servant. The Act says it's someone who is a member of an all-Pakistan service or holds a federal civil post. But wait. Look closely at what it excludes. It specifically dictates that a civil servant does not include anyone on deputation from a province, folks on a contract, or work-charged employees. You really want to keep that strict boundary in mind because it's going to be a huge deal when we talk about how this ecosystem defends itself from outside interference later on. To truly get the mechanics here, we need to contrast how people actually land these roles. Initial appointment is basically the gold standard. We're talking rigorous, competitive, merit-based recruitment, usually handled by the Federal Public Service Commission, or FPSC. On the flip side, you have a deputation, and this is fundamentally just a temporary transfer of a government servant to a post outside their parent department. So you have this clear contrast, permanent, merit-based entry on one hand versus a temporary transfer on the other. Moving on to part 2, the enforcer. The Federal Service Tribunal, or FST. Okay, so with all these complex rules, what actually happens when there's a dispute? Enter the Federal Service Tribunal. Established under Article 212 of the Constitution, this is the specialized judicial referee created specifically to handle internal disputes among civil servants. And honestly, the power this tribunal wields is massive. It holds exclusive jurisdiction over things like appointments, promotions, seniority, and disciplinary actions. That word exclusive is absolutely key here. It completely bars ordinary civil and high courts from entertaining these specific cases, which totally unburdens the standard legal system. To do its job, the FST can summon witnesses, demand documents, and annul departmental orders just like a civil court. Plus, on questions of fact, whatever the FST decides is final. But you can't just casually stroll up to the FST whenever you feel like it. The timeline is incredibly strict and mandatory. Step 1, you have to first file a departmental appeal. Step 2, you literally have to sit and wait 90 days for your department to respond. Step 3, once that time is up, or you get a final order, the clock starts ticking fast. You have exactly 30 days to file your appeal to the FST. If you miss that tiny window, your case is usually just thrown out. And finally, step 4, if you want to challenge an FST decision, your only option is the Supreme Court of Pakistan, and even then, only if it involves a major question of law. The system is designed to be exact and rigorous.
Let's look at part 3, protecting merit, the deputationist controversy. Let's see how this all plays out in the real world with a heavily litigated case from the Sindh High Court regarding the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Remember how deputationists were specifically excluded from that civil servant definition? Well, the courts, echoing the Supreme Court, made their legal stance crystal clear here. Quote, "A deputationist has no vested right to continue on deputation." The courts emphatically ruled that you absolutely cannot take posts meant for competitive FPSC recruits and just permanently fill them by absorbing someone who is only there temporarily on a transfer.
And the law enforces this with super rigid timelines to ensure these transfers stay strictly temporary. A standard deputation, 3 years maximum. Now, it can be extended for another 2 years, but you need explicit federal government approval for that.
Once you hit 5 years, though, that is an absolute legal wall. Mandatory repatriation is required. You have to go back to your parent department. There are literally zero loopholes in the rules for extending it past 5 years.
So why exactly do the courts come down so hard on this? Because permanently absorbing these temporary transfers basically bypasses the entire rigorous FPSC competitive process. Not only that, it completely messes up established provincial quotas, which directly hurts representation for provinces like Sindh and Balochistan in these federal departments. Imagine spending your whole career in a department, just waiting for your legitimate promotion, only to be blocked by an outsider who was permanently dropped into a higher rank. The courts noted that this creates deep unrest, massive frustration, and totally wrecks administrative efficiency. The whole statutory framework relies on merit and fairness. Bypassing it just breaks that trust.
Which brings us to Part 4, Everyday Reality Departmental Leave Policies of the NHMP.
So we've talked a lot about big, macro-level constitutional law. Let's look at how this actually translates on a day-to-day basis. We're going to check out the National Highways and Motorway Police. It is wildly fascinating how tightly they micromanage their daily operations through internal SOPs. Take their leave policy, for instance. Under normal circumstances, only 5% of officers in a beat or office can be on earned leave at the same time. Literally just 5%. If more apply, you go straight onto a waiting list. Also, if someone wants more than 120 days of leave, it doesn't just get a simple rubber stamp. It has to go all the way up to a specialized zonal-level committee. This intense level of micromanagement guarantees the department never suffers a critical shortage of staff on the ground.
But here is the part I find super interesting. Look at how they've taken massive life events and cleanly quantified them into this rigid matrix of rules. Getting married? The SOP dictates exactly 20 days of leave. Taking a big competitive exam to boost your career? That earns you 60 days to prep and an extra 30 if you make it to the interview. Even religious milestones are dialed in. 45 days of leave for Hajj and 21 days for Umrah. And in the tragic event of a husband passing away, a female civil servant is granted 130 days of special leave for iddat on full pay. The system basically tries to account for every human variable using pure mathematical precision.
But with those highly specific provisions comes some extremely severe accountability. Take that 60-day competitive exam leave we just talked about. If an officer applies for that time off and then doesn't actually show up to take the exam, they stand permanently disqualified from ever taking that type of leave again in the future. So yes, the ecosystem definitely supports its people, but it is fiercely protective against anyone trying to abuse the system.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We kick things off with the foundational vision of the Quad, broke down the 1973 Act, and looked at the sheer power of the Federal Service Tribunal. We saw exactly how the high courts defend the merit system against illegal absorptions, and then we zoomed way in on the incredibly precise day-to-day leave policies of the motorway police. It really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Is this insane, intricate web of macro laws, strict tribunals, and completely rigid micro-policies actually the ultimate secret to a transparent, functioning state? Because at the end of the day, this giant, complex machine is what manages the country you live in. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the civil service ecosystem. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.